which wasn't focused on the EU, but more on free trade issues. I talked very specifically about these negotiations with the Andean community and Central America. And today what I'm going to talk about is a bit different, namely the context in which the FTAs of the EU in the Latin American region have been embedded over time, and how that has changed with the EU's rhetoric towards the region. So, as a background, if you look at Latin America from the EU's perspective, there's a very dense network of EU-Latin American agreements. So we have what we could call full FTAs with 11 countries in place. One of that is a bi-regional agreement. Then we have so-called association agreements, which not only cover FTA issues, but go much further in terms of political and cooperation elements with Mexico, Chile, and then also, although it's only provisionally applied in the trade realm, with the 6 Central American states. And then we have political agreements only with all the other states that are left in the region. But the only one that's missing out is Venezuela at present, which left the Andean community, hence it has no agreement in place and it hasn't fully adhered to Mercosur yet. So Venezuela is a bit of an odd one, and so is Cuba, because of a decision that was taken in the late 1990s that Cuba would have a bit of a special stance from the EU's perspective, but that might change very soon as well. So we have a network of agreements in place with all but 2 countries. They're very different, but they're still agreements of one kind or another that lead to an important dialogue and also important trade relations between the EU and Latin America. And the background to this was that there has been a subsequent upgrade of the relations between the EU and Latin America since the early to mid 1990s, and we have seen that this was in line with Latin American economic growth. So Latin America has come to be more and more important in terms of its economic growth outlook, but also in terms of political stability that the continent has found. So there was a widespread move to relatively stable democracy, in which the EU has played a certain role. So the context of the 1990s, when the EU started to upgrade its relations with the region, is very different to the context today. So in the 1990s we saw, for instance, in the Central American countries, very slow progression towards stable democracies and party systems. Most of the countries in the region could be classified as developing countries, and if we look at it today, with a few exceptions, once again, we have mostly upper middle income economies, we have relatively stable economies, and we even have an OECD member, which is Chile. And just to show you how much the picture has changed, so the only country that really is left as GSP beneficiary, that is not covered by other trade agreements, is Bolivia in 2015. As a general background to this, so the growing economic importance of the region has meant that the EU was obviously more interested in free trade with the region, improving its ties and its economic stance. Yet the long political history of relations between the region, as I said, the EU has played an important role in the peace processes in Central America, and also cultural and other political ties that date back to the time before the official conclusion of any kind of agreement with the region, meant that any kind of change in the relationship between the EU and individual Latin American countries or regions in Latin America needs to be embedded in that changing political context. In a nutshell, you can't just have an FTA with Latin American countries without taking into consideration what has been there before and what other ties exist within the region. And so the question that I've asked myself, if you look at the change of these relations over time, is what is the context in which the FTAs of the EU with the region has been embedded over time, and whether there has been a change. And what I would argue that we see is that there has been a change from initial discovery of bi-regionalism, so where the cooperation of the EU with the region was very much based on bi-regional ties in the 1990s and up to the mid-2000s, to primacy of bilateralism. It might not necessarily look that way if you just look at the conclusion of an association agreement with Central America, but I'll argue in a minute that that is still quite different. Then we see a changed rhetoric. So where Latin America was always a sort of junior partner for the EU, where the EU goes to help and build democracy, assists in the peace processes in Central America, and so on. The rhetoric that we see now, and that we just saw 3 weeks ago at the EU CELAC summit, is that now the two regions are equals, and hence the kinds of economic and political ties that need to exist between the two regions also need to be reshaped in that way. And then we see a shift in focus from development concerns, so where the EU has been very vocal in stating in the past that its economic goals in the region were always tied to development concerns of the region, mainly regional integration concerns, sort of the idea that if the region adopted EU-style institutions, then it would grow and democracy would get even more stable and so on, to an approach that I would call trade for trade's sake, that is only veiled in this discourse of being equals, and hence we can talk more open about commercial interests. So what I base my research on is public documents, internal documents, and then also the semi-structured interviews conducted over the first half of this year. And just to give you an overview of the kinds of agreements that we have seen. So the third generation agreements is what's generally called PCAs, Partnership and Cooperation Agreements. And they basically do not concern FDA issues. Those were being dealt with GSP and other mechanisms. And we saw a limited scope for political dialogue, but also dialogue on cooperation issues. So essentially, development policy. The EU has moved to these third generation agreements over the course of the 1990s and early 2000s. And from there on, we've moved to a fourth generation of agreements, which basically, in the political and cooperation realm, leads to more intensified dialogues between, for instance, the EU and Mexico, and the EU and Chile in those first two rounds, and they include classic FTAs for the countries concerned. So the three entities with which we have such agreements are Mexico, Chile, and then the provisionally applied association agreement with Central America. We have what we could call classic FTAs in place with Colombia, Peru, and now Ecuador has finished negotiating with the EU in the latter half of 2014. And then the already mentioned strategic partnerships, which are largely political in scope and don't really concern that many issues in the commercial realm, aside from a dialogue on those issues that could lead to some smaller agreements. And then we see a proposal for a sort of fifth generation of agreements, which has very much come out of the recent summit, but also talks that have been done in the past. So that is basically to upgrade the agreements with Mexico and Chile, to upgrade the political dialogue and cooperation chapters, to take to incorporate the fact that these countries are no longer developing countries, or at least no longer considered as such. So the cooperation chapter pretty much has become useless in its current form, and to upgrade the FTA to new issues. And just to show you how complex the network of negotiations is, so we see the EU over time has started negotiations with different entities and tried to negotiate an association agreement with the Andean Community of Nations. That hasn't worked. We have moved on to the FTA realm, and then we might see the upgrade with negotiations possibly starting in 2016 with Mexico and Chile, depending on who you ask, whether it's DG Trade and the European Commission or the External Action Service. There are some different preferences in those two institutions. Now to talk you through these three different elements that I've observed. So in the late 1990s to mid-2000s, we really have seen this focus on bi-regionalism. If you look at the PCAs concluded, they're mostly concluded with regional integration organizations on the continent. The development programs that were in place from the European Commission were largely based on such sub-regional entities, including budget support for the institutions themselves and technical assistance. And the association agreements proposed in the mid-2000s with Central America and the Andean community were largely being dealt with outside of the 2006 Global European. So they, the preparatory work for those got underway beforehand. So they were seen as something that was quite apart. We've moved on to this more bilateral stance now, but we see already in the rhetoric that comes out of summits and also various policy papers that regional integration as a policy goal of the EU and Latin America is largely absent now. We've seen a strengthening of ties with what we call strategic partners like Brazil, If you look at the actual association agreements concluded, we do see the bi-regional element in the political and cooperation realm, but if you look at the FTAs in practice, such as the Central America FTA, they are with the 6 countries individually, which also meant that they could enter in force subsequently after they were ratified in those countries, which also meant that the agreement with Central America is quite long, I think about 1,500 pages, because they had to deal with those specific issues. And then if you look at the at what DG DevCo is doing, it has now moved on to a continental scheme of programs, so eradicating poverty would be one, but then a much more targeted bilateral approach towards individual countries. If you look at the issue of the primacy of development concerns, so in the negotiations that we saw, for instance, with Mexico, there were quite extensive debates on issues that the EU needs to include in its agreement, such as the democracy clause, which if you talk to people now for the upgrade of that set agreement will probably not be an issue, because most of that has been dealt with in the past, and the new elements that would have to be included in line with the key in terms of such agreements of the EU are relatively uncontroversial. So most of the legwork there has already been done in the past. We see that there was some conditionality on regional integration, so negotiations only got underway with Central America despite attempts from some of the countries in the region to negotiate bilaterally with the European Union. And it's that we saw extensive programs that focused really on development issues, and not the kinds of issues that we would see emerging today. And now if you look at the kinds of agreements signed since then, so Peru, Colombia, and Ecuador are pure FTAs, so there isn't even the cooperation or political element present in those anymore. As I said, the bilateral, the CICA agreement is bilateral in nature. And we see a few other issues where we can really tell that trade has become the primary concern from the European side in those relations. Lastly, if you look at this issue of Latin America being a junior partner, so what happened in the past was largely unilateral. So we could talk about the contribution of the EU to the peace processes, GSP schemes and such, and the kind of technical assistance that the region received. Whereas now we see that the dialogue happens on a much more equal basis. So actually the Latin American partners were very vocal, sometimes the first ones in raising the potential of FTAs with the European Union. If you look at the proposals for 5th generation agreements, cooperation becomes largely redundant. And the kinds of cooperation that now occurs with the European Union, just looking again at what happened at the summit a few weeks ago, is something that really happens on an equal footing. So Colombia and Peru now have visa waivers for the Schengen area, and so really move on to a different set of issues that is not based on the sort of Latin America being a developing continent anymore, but it's more focusing on multilateral issues that both regions can tackle together. So just some very preliminary conclusions. So obviously EU commercial interest in Latin America has grown in line with its economic importance for the world economy, but also in terms of the EU's trade policy. But the history of these relations happening in political context has meant that the FTA negotiations between the EU and Latin America had to be embedded in different contexts. So where it was a language of development and regional integration in the past, we have now moved on to something that is based on this language of both regions being equals, and that trade can help these countries come out of the risk of staying upper medium income economies for a longer time. All right, that's it.
Thank you very much, Daniel. And finally, we have Magdalena Larsson from the University of Westminster, who's presenting on the EU-India FTA, new dynamics in EU trade negotiations.
Yes, so I'm looking at the FTA negotiations between the EU and India, which started in 2007 and are supposed to lead to a broad-based trade and investment agreement if they are ever concluded. And what I try to do is to explore how some of the general changes that we can see in EU trade policy have affected the dynamic of EU trade negotiations, both internally within the EU and between the EU and India. But before I do that, I just want to put these negotiations against the background of how trade negotiations have often been portrayed in the literature in the past. So the literature has focused very much on the internal divisions within the Council, looking at different member state preferences, and also looking to some extent at the difference between the Council and the Commission. And because of the difficulty in finding a compromise between different member states' interests, the Commission, once they have found this agreement, has often been seen as a very inflexible negotiator and someone which is unable to make compromises easily, because that would mean going back to the member state and open up the package deal again. And some even portray the EU negotiators as sort of offering their partners a take it or leave it